Good afternoon, Senators. The Committee of the Whole is now back in session. We completed Senator San Nicolas' amendment. However, there was a request for perhaps another round. And so I want to recognize any senator who wished to discuss this amendment. Senator Muña, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I thank my colleague next door here for giving us the opportunity to really absorb this and look at it a little bit more thoroughly, because some of our colleagues did raise a point that it is substantially different, although it doesn't look like it, but it is. And so I have some concerns, simple concerns about some of the language in here, about exempting the Guam resident. And I'm just trying to imagine that in order for the Guam resident to not pay, we're the ones who have to present the ID. So I'm just thinking that the 2% sales tax is already going to be in all of the POS systems. It's already going to be included. So in order for them to give that discount, that we have to show the ID or whatever type of identification that says that we're from here. So I'm just thinking it's a little bit more of an inconvenience for us as a Guam resident to have to present something whenever we purchase something. And I'm even thinking of like some of the young kids, I don't know, maybe they go down the store to the mom and pop store and they have to have their student ID in order for them to be exempted from this 2% sales tax. If they don't have it, then they get charged it because it's automatic. So I'm just thinking about certain things like that, simple concerns. And then I was also looking a little bit more into like section 26705 and all these businesses who renew their licenses that charge the general sales tax, an additional $10,000 per year for an application. I've never applied for a business license that sells, but that just seems like a lot, $10,000 per year for a license fee. Seems pretty significant for a business. And I'm trying to break it down, and I don't think anybody on this floor really wants to raise taxes to our people. And I was trying to put my head again around the $39 figure that the author of this amendment kept emphasizing. $39 could be a tank of gas. $39 could be, I don't know, a dozen eggs and a loaf of bread, and I don't know, pick 5 meats or something. I'm not sure. But if you take that $39 figure, 2% of goods and services to equal $39, that would be like $2,000 worth of goods and services a month to pay 2%. That equals $39. I don't know anybody, not even myself, who pays $2,000 worth of goods and services a month. I can't afford that. So I think really it's all about affordability, because if you can afford $2,000 worth of items and services, then maybe you can afford $39. I mean, maybe it seems significant for people who can't afford $39, but if you can afford to pay $2,000 on anything, I think $39 is not that significant. So even if you break it down, you only spend $1,000 worth of goods and services a month, right? And you break that in half, that would be $20. I mean, I just feel like we're trying to find a well-balanced solution here for this fiscal crisis, and we're already realigning the government and restructuring it so that it could be more functional at the most minimal, with the most minimal at this point. And then I think that the 2% is balanced, because if a person can afford $1,000 worth of goods and services a month, then they can afford an extra $20. I don't know, I'm just thinking. if you can afford $500 and you can afford $5. But if you break that down into a week's worth of, which I think most people go out and they do their shopping on a weekly basis, right? I think the average person goes out and shops for food and buys Pampers or whatnot, maybe at most $200 a week. What's 2% of $200? $4? Yeah, so I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. We got to save the people, and we cannot impose this $4 on them. I don't know. I can't see the devastation. I still can't, even at $39 a month. So I'm still. I can't. I don't see me supporting this bill, only because our tourism industry is already wounded, and it would be like, shooting a man who's already down. I wouldn't want to do that. So with that, Mr. Chair, I can't support this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Espaldon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I appreciate the time that you've given us to really, think about it over the past 2 hours. A lot of the points have been raised, and the previous speaker kind of also articulated, I guess, the math in my own head as well. $39 a month, let's call it an even 40 just for simple math, extra $10 a week. And realistically, I do see a lot of folks who are in the lower end of the income spectrum in our society. I meet up with them a lot of times in our friendly neighborhood corner store, the neighborhood store. They're buying really non-essential stuff, to tell you the truth. At least, they walk out with the chips and the Coke and things like that. If they spend $10, they spend 20 cents more on, is what it comes out to. I mean, so I understand the math. Again, I'm just torn on this one because I understand the underlying intent of this amendment is to really try to protect those who can least afford any increase in taxes. On top of it, and this is just neither here nor there, but I'm going to say it anyway, that because of the new federal tax laws, and it's an issue that has come up in the past, of course, would be the increase in minimum wage. And if that's still, and now that the companies, the corporations have been able to get a significant tax cut, maybe it's one of those things that will come to the forefront one more time. And with that, again, the affordability of a 2% increase, a 2% tax, I should say, may not be that significant if that goes forward. But even then, it was mentioned previously also that those on the lower end of the spectrum of the income scale, it was noted that many of them actually don't really pay into the taxes, right, and actually get money back through their earned income tax credit. On top of it, they receive assistance, federal assistance, governmental assistance, right, whether it be in the form of food stamps and whatnot. And as discussed yesterday, those who do have the ability or who do qualify for the SNAP program, right, the food stamp program, those goods that they will be buying with the SNAP card are not taxable anyway. A colleague of ours in here who's been at GVB has noted that, and it was mentioned by the previous speaker, that the industry itself is very sensitive, and it's true. We're no longer one of the few destinations in the Pacific that Asian tourists go to anymore. And now, again, we know that there's been expanded tourism into the Philippines, into Thailand, into Malaysia, into many other destinations. In fact, they probably even have greater attractions than we do, because perhaps of their cheap labor, because of the environmental offerings that they have. Perhaps they have beaches just like ours, but they also have grottos and river cruises and all the other things. So we need to remain competitive on the tourism front. The mover of the amendment did acknowledge that in Japan and in Korea, the sales tax there is much higher. I think he's mentioned that Japan was at 10% and Korea was at 8%. So they're accustomed to paying it. The caveat there, though, is for those who do travel to, I believe it's Korea, I'm not sure how Japan treats it, but if you save your sales receipts, or there's some kind of process in which, even though as a visitor you go over there and you pay for an item that is with a tax on it, you could actually get reimbursed for the taxes you paid if on the way out at the airport you kind of give them your receipts or whatever form you have to fill out, and they reimburse you for those taxes. So again, are we going to follow that same model or not? And maybe it's inconsequential for a tourist, because I know that when I do travel, and probably everybody here travels, and I know a lot of us have gone to the Philippines, you stay at a hotel, there's the VAT, there's this, there's all different kinds of taxes that are laid out, and you don't really question it. I mean, you may not like it, but you don't question it because you pay it, because that just comes, that's the price you're going to have to pay, on top of the room charge. But I still have to give kudos to the mover of the amendment, because this is something that's significant. And I guess the very first speaker when this amendment came said, well, this is quite substantially different from what's before us, and it hasn't had a public hearing. And to that degree, I think I would have to agree, because one of the sectors of our economy who were not at the previous, or not really well represented at the previous hearings for the other bills before us, right? Now this becomes of interest, and in particular, we're talking about the hotel industry and the tourist industry. And so to create a new tax on our tourism industry at 6% would need at least some input from them. I'm sorry to say. I'm sorry to say it, but I'm not. Because it's important that we hear from their side, but I'm sorry to say it, because then this would delay really any movement on this amendment at this time. I'm torn. I like the concept of trying to have our residents not pay the increased taxes and have visitors and those who are not residents pay for it, for any increase. But at the same time, it doesn't raise the amount of revenue, I believe, at this time that we need. But the caveat to that, though, or at least the opposite side of that, is even if we don't give this government the full $60 to $120 million annually that we need to be at least status quo, it does force us to really take a look at our own internal workings of how we can streamline ourselves, how we can contain our costs, and really pushes us even further. So in this dilemma or this crisis that we're in, it is an opportunity to retool, to retrench, to redefine ourselves, so that going forward, perhaps we can have a more efficient, more cost-effective government. But there are a lot of things that need to change in our government. I'd like to say I can support this, but I have reservations. I guess one of the questions I do need to ask, just to make clear in my mind, I might know the answer, but I'm not certain, is under Section 4, the effective date. And this is that this act shall be effective not later than 30 days after the enactment of a fiscal realignment plan for fiscal year 2018, which reduces net appropriations not less than $37 million. Now, I know in the discussions that we've had over the past several weeks, $37 million was kind of the number that's been put out by the administration that we could really try to reduce our expenses by. But after conversations, really, with the administration being here, the more realistic number is $30 million. And that's because the Department of Education, who's been tasked to reduce their budget by $19 million, can really only come up with $12 million before they really start to bleed, you know, and it affects the classrooms. So $37 million, I think, at least from the conversations we've had with the panel who's been up here, is probably a little too high, and $30 million is a more realistic number. But that even that forces us still to look for further revenue enhancements, and I think that'll be in the days to come after we get out of all these special sessions and figure out what we're going to do in terms of trying to increase some of the revenues. So even though this plan before us right now and this amendment would raise only, I believe, $20 million till the end of the fiscal year, that means it will still need to make up $47 million. And I think it is upon us, as well as the administration, to try to figure that one out. But I get away from the question. The question is, if we go to the enactment of a fiscal realignment plan, what is the process? I mean, I know that the governor sent down what's supposed to be a fiscal realignment plan, and basically what he did is he took the budget that we had passed for fiscal years 2018 and basically crossed out certain figures that go to the department and reduced it by a certain amount, by a pro rata amount. And but the enactment of fiscal, does that require legislation then to be passed? And I guess that's the simple question to the author.
Senator, do you yield?
I do. If the inquirer could please repeat the question.
Oh yeah, no, it's just the process of the enactment of a fiscal realignment plan. That has to be in bill form and go through the legislative process. Is that how this works?
I would presume the way that it's written in the amendment is that the tax increase will not be effective until a fiscal realignment plan is adopted, showing a $37 million cost containment in the form of cuts or cost expenditure reductions. So I would imagine that would definitely be in bill form.
It would have to be in both. Yeah, no, and only because the way it's worded is that after the enactment, usually it's a bill that's enacted and approved by the legislature. And so, you know, part of the question in my own mind, and it's not directed at the author or the mover of this amendment, is how long would that take to get down to that real number, whether it's $37 million, whether it's $47 million, whether it's $30 million. And so this effective date, I appreciate it, but the question is, in my own mind, how realistic is it to be able to move and start collecting any kind of revenues to avert any kind of financial meltdown at the most severest, right, where people start taking furloughs and, you know, essential services start to get really cut or hampered. I'm not sure of that right now. But again, I just wanted to at least, before we broke for lunch, to be able to think a little bit more about everything that's been said, to really think about this plan. There's a lot of things I like about it, right? But I think that some points were made, specifically about the tourism market that we have. It's a very fragile industry, and it's our biggest economic engine. And if something happens to that, or if we cause our main economic engine to falter, then we might find ourselves in a worse situation than we are now. The other thing is, again, the lack of input from the industry that's most affected by this amendment causes some concern as well without that conversation being had. But I thank you for the opportunity to think this over, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Espadon. Any other members wish to discuss Senator Lee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have to say that I do agree with the mover of this amendment, and I've been pretty consistent about not wanting to place this tax on our people. I know that some members of this body have mentioned that this is just a nominal cost, but I disagree with that. I really feel like there are so many working families out there that are struggling. They're living paycheck to paycheck, and they can't make ends meet. And even though it might be a nominal cost for one item, all of these items at the end of when they go to check out, all of those things add up. And I think all of the people in this room can agree that, you know, you go buy for something for $7.99, another thing for $12.99, and by the end of your shopping time, you know, you're way over your budget. And I think a lot of people out there can relate to that. And I really appreciate the mover of this amendment being creative and thinking outside the box. I think we need to throw every solution that we can possibly think of at this problem and see what sticks. So I'm very grateful to the mover of this amendment for proffering this for our discussion. I do want to say that I'm very concerned that this may have negative impacts that we can't foresee at this time to our top two industries. It may affect tourism, which is our main economic driver, as well as the military. And so that definitely raises some concerns with me. I'm also concerned that it would affect working families that are related to these two industries. So working families that may have jobs in the tourism industry as bellhops, as taxi drivers, as people who work in our hotels and in our restaurants. A lot of our small businesses are really driven by the tourism industry. Some of them own optional tours or provide services to our tourists, and I'm just concerned that we haven't really had a discussion on what the effect would be on these individuals, on these families. I'm also aware that many of our tour packages, especially out of markets like Japan, are only sold a couple times a year. And so when you have these group tour packages and they're sold, let's say in April and again in October, once we make a change this big, it could affect all of the tour packages for that group of months. And if we decide at a later time that we want to make a change to this, it may be already too late. We may have already done the damage to our number one industry. And again, I know that I was on the record a few days ago in discussing this, but we have to remember that tourism is our largest employer. 20,000 jobs on our island, Mr. Chair, are tourism related. 1 out of every 3 jobs can trace its roots back to tourism. And so that means, in dollars and cents, $150 million generated in taxes from this industry alone. And so, like the previous speaker, I think we really need to just consider what the effect would be on tourism as our main industry and on the families that are employed by our tourism industry. I'm very concerned that we haven't given both our tourism stakeholders and our military stakeholders, these top 2 industries, a chance to respond to a proposal like this. And I think when we're dealing with the 3-legged stool of our military, our tourism industry, and our government, we have to make sure that we maintain that stability and keep our island's main economic drivers very strong and supported. I do want to say that, you know, this is an opportunity, this fiscal crisis is an opportunity for us. I really view it as an opportunity for us to bring these creative solutions to the forefront, to have a discussion, to have the dialogue about it, and vet them properly. And I think that's the benefit of being in this branch of government, Mr. Chair, is that we're all operating in this very deliberative body, and we have the opportunity to really look at these solutions closely, ask the proper questions, get information from our subject matter experts and the people in the industry that live these things day to day, and ask them to help inform our decision making. Yes, it does take some time, and it's not going to be a quick fix, but I really, again, want to state for the record that I appreciate this kind of out-of-the-box thinking. I think it's very creative, and we need to continue to move forward with solutions like this. I'm just very concerned that at this pace, we haven't given the proper vetting and an opportunity for our stakeholders to respond to a proposal that is wide-sweeping as this. And so I thank you for the time, Mr. Chair. Sujos Masi.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee. Any other senator on the San Nicolas amendment? If Senator Esteves?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity. I know I spoke earlier, but as a retiring speaker had said, you know, this is a fairly substantial measure. And what I failed to realize earlier, that this is almost a substitution of what we've been talking about for the last couple of days and what was publicly heard during the public hearing. I have concerns. You know, there were some red flags initially when I reviewed this measure, and I had to go back and I had to look at my notes regarding similar issues that I've run into working on another measure, and specifically with regards to my concern of how this may infringe upon the Commerce Clause and the constitutionality of this amendment. Mr. Chairman, this is really not a novel idea. States have been trying to tax outsiders, tax non-residents, and apply other discriminatory taxation for decades. And that's why the Commerce Clause is there. I think maybe this could work with more research and more input, but I have grave concerns. There is an exception. There are a couple of exceptions with regards to language and intent. Although this amendment may apply the tax to everybody, but then say we're going to exempt these individuals, that presents a couple of different problems, and I'll share this with you. The measure, Mr. Chairman, of applying the exemptions in the same bill as we apply the taxation, and with the exemptions I talk about a subgroup, residents, non-residents. When you apply these exemptions in the same bill, it presents a couple of problems. Because if it's challenged, then that puts the entire public law at risk, and the tax and every part of it that may be valid, as opposed to having a separate measure on an exemption to an existing tax law. Again, Mr. Chairman, as it reads, the language says that there is a tax that will apply to everybody. But then this tax does not apply to Guam residents, which again is not a novel idea. It sounds nice on paper, but we now have on public record, public officials saying this will generate more money through the military. They'll be the ones paying a good share of this tax. We've already seen in our history, Mr. Chairman, that'll get used against us in the court. It doesn't matter what the language of the law says. It's how it's applied. With regards to the Commerce Clause and how it applies to Guam, Mr. Chairman, after months of research, it's still a very gray area, because in some instances it applies and others it doesn't. And so I think to move forward with this substantial measure like this without enough input on an already complicated measure that we had been deliberating over that had a public hearing, I have issues with it. I'm not saying it couldn't work, but I have concerns, Mr. Chairman, with putting our eggs into one basket. The sales tax is a mid to long-term solution. I think we all understand it's not necessarily a short-term solution, but we do need mid to long-term solutions. We do need to evolve and find progress. But to put all of that into a gray area or at risk when we really don't know. And Mr. Chairman, for the sake of consistency, the substantial amendments that have gone into 248 have all been publicly heard or discussed at great length over the last couple of weeks by members of this body. This measure hasn't, and I would normally not have an issue with that, except that I have real concerns that this may be unconstitutional. And then if we're basing our revenue projections in the next fiscal year on these revenues, and that gets challenged, the law gets overturned, or for whatever reason, or has a negative effect on the economy, we'll be right back here trying to figure out what to do next. And so, I appreciate the creative thought, but I know many of my colleagues have said, and I agree, that a lot of the measures we're putting forward, especially with regards to taxation, are very complicated matters, Mr. Chairman. And I think any substantive measure deserves and should have, so that this body remains consistent, should have a public hearing. Mr. Chairman, both tax bills had a public hearing. The reorganization plan had a public hearing. Even the governor's bills to increase the GRT, we forced to have a public hearing. And now we have this, and we're potentially going to ignore the need to have a public hearing and have experts weigh in, and to have military family members weigh in. You know, Mr. Chairman, I did have to look back at the record, some things that were made. I was active duty military, Mr. Chairman. It's not just as easy as you just go get another state driver's license. Residency with regards to active duty military is a bit more complicated matter than that. A resident from a certain state can't just get a Guam driver's license because they have to maintain residency in their state because of property, or to be able to vote for their elected officials.
Point of information, Mr. Chairman, there's just a lot of misinformation being presented. The bill does not force any military member to change their state of domicile. All it does is it requires that a Guam resident be specifically defined. And the definition that we have in the bill is actually very narrow. And in fact, we specifically wrote on page 2, line 13, for the purposes of this article, the following definitions apply. And so Guam resident is very narrowly defined in this article to specifically mean somebody who possesses a Guam ID, somebody who possesses a Guam driver's license, a valid student identification, or any United States government or Guam government identification and a corresponding water bill, power bill, or piece of mail. So the suggestion from the current speaker that we're going to force military people to change their residency is factually inaccurate. You can continue to be a resident of Delaware and file your taxes in Delaware and will continue to receive your Section 30 money, and you can have a Guam driver's license. Or you can go and get a Guam ID and you won't change your state of residency. So aside from that and the assertions to the Commerce Clause that are incorrect and the constitutionality questions that are also inaccurate, I would ask the current speaker to at least state facts rather than trying to scare people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I have no problem allowing that indulgence, but it gives me the opportunity to clarify, because I wasn't finished with my statement with regards to residency. In order for a military member to change their residency, it's a deliberate process, and they have to file for the residency change, and it actually depends on the state. I understand, we're not forcing anyone to change their residency. And that's kind of based on the assumption that everybody lives off island. You don't get a power bill if you live on base housing or if you live in the barracks. Mr. Chairman, we'll agree to disagree, but this screams discriminatory taxation. It's the thought that this is just a magical idea that nobody's ever thought of, taxing outside residents. It's a ridiculous notion. It's been tried many times, and it has failed many times. I can admit when I'm wrong. I just like to be proven wrong in this matter. But to put this in the measure without a public hearing, to allow for the input so that I could be proven wrong on my assertion as a colleague and as another elected official, I think is a disservice. So my objection remains on this measure for the pure fact that I believe that it is very substantial and has multiple implications and deserves a public hearing like all of the other substantive measures that have been brought before this body. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Esteves. Anyone else wish to speak on the San Nicolas amendment? If not, I'm going to ask the senator to close on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to, prior to my closing, just advise the body that if anybody wishes clarification on legality, legal counsel is but 15 paces away.
Senator, can you hold on, please, to Senator Nelson? Did you have a...
Can I just say something? Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank for the previous speaker, for putting out the question of whether it's substantive and whether we should have a public hearing. And I feel that either way, we're going to need some kind of influx in revenue quick. And this 2% sales tax is going to impact the entire island of Guam. And so if we were really, and I know everyone hates this term, but if we were really doing our due diligence, we should have went to every village and held a public hearing or a town hall meeting there to hear what the people have to say. Because when we had our public hearing for the 2% sales tax, we didn't have the common people really come forward and fill the public hearing room testify. Perhaps the time of day impacted their attendance. So I don't know. I don't know. I just wanted to share my thoughts. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for indulging.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Senator San Nicolas, you can close now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the input from my colleagues. In closing, I would like to take a moment to address some of the items that were brought up over the course of this afternoon since we've returned. First, there was a statement that IDs, having someone present their identification, would pose some kind of an inconvenience to our people. And, we do that all the time, Mr. Chairman, when we make a purchase of a credit card. You ask for your ID, it takes 2 seconds. If it's too much of an inconvenience, you don't need to show it and you'll pay the tax. The concern that student IDs is cumbersome, I actually think it's a good byproduct of this policy. I think it will be very good for our students to carry around their IDs regularly. It'll be safer for them, and it'll also teach them responsibility. So I don't find that as a negative. I actually see that as a type of positive. The concern that the $10,000 business license charge is a bit much. Bear in mind, Mr. Chairman, that the way this amendment is written, that particular business license charge is only if the business wants to be able to incorporate the tax into the price. This is an option that's being provided for those businesses, particularly the duty-free businesses, so that they don't need to have a tax line item on their receipt. And the increase in the business license charge is to help offset the cost to revenue tax for having to go out and do a special assessment because it's a different application of the sales tax. This will help us make sure that anybody who is choosing to incorporate it into their price is actually getting looked at a lot more closely. I am also of the mind that these duty-free enterprises, I think we've read the papers, we see how much they spend just on litigation alone. I don't think a $10,000 business license, in order for them to be able to maintain their pricing model, is going to break the bank whatsoever for them. Some other statements that were made, Mr. Chairman, deeply bothered me. One of them was that, this tax, whether it's a $39, and this is based on the analysis that was provided in the hearing, whether it's $39 a month or whether it's $25 a month, it was alluded to that somehow that isn't hard and you can't see the devastation in that. And, I would have to agree in part, because you won't see the devastation in that. That kind of devastation comes in a very invisible form. You won't see children getting fed less nutritious foods, or parents foregoing ice cream for their kids. You won't see your neighbor's water getting cut off because they couldn't pay their water bill. You won't see the family next door staying home and not being able to go to the beach because the cost of living is just rising too much and gas is expensive, and now we're taxing them an additional 2% on their purchases, and while we're exempting liquid fuel, they do have $25 less in their pocket. You won't see them making those kind of choices. There's a reason why this tax is called regressive. It hurts our poorest. And unless you live among them, you definitely won't see it. You will not see the devastation. As I listened this afternoon, I just can't help but see the irony in the notion that somehow $25 for our people is nothing, but $25 for a tourist is going to kill them. I can't help but notice the irony that somehow $25 on our poorest is less of a concern than $25 in the tourism industry. I mentioned the numbers previously, Mr. Chairman. We're talking about 33,000 filers that are in our lowest income brackets. And maybe I need to say what those brackets are for us to really understand how pervasive this invisible devastation is going to be. $33,000 of our filers make, as a married filing couple, if they're married, $18,000 and below a year. Couples with children. And what's just even more ironic, Mr. Chairman, is that you know which industry is the worst paying, largest employer industry on this island? The tourism industry. We're going to raise the tax on that group of people that just so happens to be working there. They get paid $9.35 on average per hour. Multiply that by 2,080 hours on a full-time basis, as if they wish they could work full-time, and that's only $18,000. The average income of all of our workers, and it's no wonder why 33,000 of them fall into those brackets. And for us to say that $25 to them is nothing, but $25 to a tourist is impossible to fathom is just, it astounds me. 16,000 are even less than that in the filing. Over 55% of our people. So, if we're worried about tourism, Mr. Chairman, let me remind this body that as the cost of living goes up and people get desperate, we're going to have more purse snatchings. We're going to have more break-ins into tourist cars, and they're going to post that on their social media and send it back home. And for want of saving $25 on a visitor that is here, we're instead going to put that $25 on an overburdened community. And the very industry that we're expressing so much concern about is all of a sudden going to find itself spending millions more than the 16 or 14 million they already spent on marketing just to try and walk back from the cliff Guam's image of being unsafe because of an increase in the crime rate as a result of just more people struggling. I'd like to remind this body that this amendment is a different option, but we are still talking about a tax increase. So even if we don't pass this and we go back to the original language, we're still talking about a 2% sales tax, which would still be paid by the tourists and the non-resident military personnel. Instead of paying $25 on an average of tourist spend of $400, they'll be paying $8. At what point does it become a diminishing issue unless the intent is to just, for the sake of the tourism industry, vote down any tax increase altogether, and then that puts us right back to square one. And if we're going to find a way forward, square one is exactly the place we need to step forward from. And that's what this amendment intends to do, in a way that is not going to increase the cost of living on our people, in a way that does provide an avenue for certain businesses in the industry to be able to put the pricing into their product. And what does this mean? It means that the $1,000 fancy bag is going to be $1,060. And it means that if a resident of Guam presents their Guam driver's license when they buy that $1,000 or $6,060 bag, you got to discount the $60. So I ask my colleagues to carefully consider their vote on this measure and realize that the alternative as presented in the original bill or in a gross receipts tax increase or in any of the other options that were presented before us, that increase in the cost of living is going to affect the very same tourism industry that everybody's saying they're concerned about here. I, for one, I'm not so sure about the trade-off, but I just think that doing this amendment and proceeding in this fashion, it gives us a way forward that tries to be as much of a win-win as possible and tries to contain the impact into a particular area that we've all been seeing the headlines has been just going gangbusters. Record month. We do have some news stories about how our markets are shifting from Japan to Korea. And that happened without a tax. The change and the shifts are going to be inevitable. The question is, how are we going to make policy here for the benefit of our people and not to cause them greater harm? So, Mr. Chairman, I humbly ask my colleagues to kindly consider this amendment. And I agree with some of the retiring speakers that we need to put all options on the table. And I am proud to say that at least we have before us one option that is not going to increase the cost of living on our people, and it is also going to require this government to meet the fiscal crisis halfway with a reflection of the cuts that they've been talking about over these past several weeks. So I humbly ask for my colleagues' support on this measure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator San Nicolas. There's been an objection to the San Nicolas amendment. So all those in favor of the San Nicolas amendment, please signify by raising your hands. Motion fails. Five. Senator Morrison, or Senator San Nicolas.
I'll yield, Mr. Chairman. I may have additional items, but at this time I yield.
I will take a 1-minute recess. Okay, we're back on. Senator Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday, Mr. Chairman, we worked to address how we should proceed with promulgating the rules and regulations regards to and how we'll implement a general sales tax. And I appreciate the discussion yesterday and determining how much time will be needed to promulgate these rules. There was concerns that we may be rushing the Department of Revenue Tax to move in a timely manner so that we can meet a certain timeline. We were all looking possibly at April 1st and seeing if that could happen, but that concern is still lies before this body that we may be rushing the Department of Revenue Tax to adopt or proceed with rules and regs and maybe bypass stakeholders in our community. I think many folks have been reaching out to all of us and trying to understand how the sales tax will be incorporated. And I think their concerns are valid, knowing that they haven't been heard, or they're looking for more discussion on this, wanting more to provide more testimony to help it work. But Mr. Chairman, the fact remains is I think none of us want to, although there is support out there to transition to a sales tax, I think there's also concerns to not rush this process. I think it's very important that we did adopt an amendment yesterday, or pass an amendment that ensures that revenue tax proceed with ample time. I think 180 days is not rushing the process. I think they should use every day to ensure that key stakeholders, our people will be given the opportunity to provide testimony or provide input and ensure that we do transition as smoothly as possible. Mr. Chairman, it comes to back kind of full circle and what we've been discussing about how things are happening every day. We're seeing things starting to trickle in, and every single day there's a new service of our government being looked at to shut down. Department of Education has put out information of moving into their plan phase of notices to be given to their employees. And just recently, we all know the Guam Memorial Hospital barely made payroll, and we're not sure, or there's a lot of uncertainty what lies ahead with the next pay period. I'm very concerned, Mr. Chairman, that hearing the numbers that is being collected by this government to address its obligations provides a lot of uncertainty for our people, a lot of anxiety. I just don't want to leave today, Mr. Chairman. I think we've been going home and in the comfort of our families, and still, I know many of us are still very concerned about our community, our people, our government, those employees that have reached out to us trying to figure out what's going on. And certainly, Mr. Chairman, we don't want to go another day without that. So I'm taking a little bit more time to ensure that this amendment, I believe, has come back to us. I tried to address this amendment to get us to a point where hopefully we can all agree that this government does need resources to get us to the end of the fiscal year. I believe all the work that's been put into this measure with the amendment that have passed to allow for this government to reorganize itself, and other amendments that provided for cost-cutting measures. So certainly we want to keep that all intact. However, moving to a general sales tax in such a short term and looking at April 1st or within that time frame, it doesn't seem practical that we can achieve that, understanding that we don't want to rush the Department of Revenue Tax to promulgate these rules. So I have this amendment, Mr. Chairman, that allows for a BPT increase of 1%, from 4% to 5%, with a sunset provision that expires on September 30th. I go back, Mr. Chairman, to the rules that we are working with regards to transitioning to a sales tax, and it calls for 180 days. I think it's important that, as I stated earlier, that we exhaust every single day to ensure that a sales tax rules and regs can be implemented. So, Mr. Chairman, this is basically, I would call it a hybrid, so that we can ensure that the government has resources to, effective April 1st, to ensure that we can avert any potential furloughs, any more cuts of government services, and ensure that we can transition to a general sales tax either in mid or somewhere down the line within this time frame of 188 days. I spoke to many of my colleagues, Mr. Chairman, and I think we're all trying to grasp how we are going to really transition, and I think we all have that concern. If even should we pass a general sales tax, is it really going to work? Are we really going to collect what we think we're going to collect? Are the businesses ready? And I think we're all on the same page that there's a lot of uncertainty there. So I asked my colleagues for their support for this amendment, allow our government to have the additional or the resources to address this fiscal challenge that we have at this time, and work to these mid to long-term solutions. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Morrison. Senator San Augustine?
Mr. Chairman, I ask that if we can recess for a few minutes, and the only reason why is because I'm having my staff print out, just in case something like this would happen, of what would be generated if a 5% BBT and no sales tax, so that everybody can see, all my colleagues can see exactly what would be generated in the next 6 months based on what he's recommending. Because I had that all spread out. I just didn't see a need to bring it, but I have my staff printing. If I can get a recess to have that printed.
Okay, we'll recess for 2 minutes. The Committee of the Whole is now called to order. Senator Morrison, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Want to thank legal for guidance in ensuring that we address the language here properly. So, Mr. Chairman, I move to withdraw my amendment, and I have a new amendment before the body.
On the motion to withdraw the initial amendment, any objections? Okay, Senator, you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, the new amendment before my colleagues, there's two sections to the bill that read. In the section, the effective date of the general sales tax, the general sales tax provisions of this act shall be effective on October 1st, 2018. The following section be the effective date and sunset of the business privilege tax increase, and it reads, notwithstanding any provision of law, rule, or regulation beginning on April 1st, 2018, the business privilege tax shall be 5% and shall remain in effect until September 30, 2018. During the period when the effective business privilege tax rate is 5%, the Department of Revenue and Taxation shall adopt rules and regulation for the implementation and administration of the general sales tax established by this act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Morrison. Senator San Nicolas.
Mr. Chairman, of all the proposals that we've entertained over these past several weeks, I think this is a marriage of the worst of both worlds. First, we're going to have a business privilege tax increase. And then on September 30th, it's going to go away and be replaced with a 2% sales tax. So first, it's a 1% business privilege tax increase that's going to be put into all the prices of the goods and services on the island. It's going to cause all the prices to go up, as we've seen in the past. When the business privilege tax is increased, the prices go up. It's going to make the business privilege tax, that increase, sunset on September 30th, but the prices aren't going to go down, because we've seen that in the past, where you raise the business privilege tax and prices go up, and then you roll it back and the prices don't come back down. So we're going to immediately cause a price increase that's going to be sticky, and then we're going to levy a sales tax on top of that price increase. It's a compounded double whammy on our people. The previous conversations of the course of this day were about sparing our people, and this is actually doubling down on them, because you're going to raise the business privilege tax, and it's not transparent. As I mentioned, I don't even remember, several days ago, when they raised the business privilege tax 2%, almost a decade ago, over a decade ago, the price of my green tea went from $1 to $1.10, a 10% increase. Business privilege tax went up 2%, but the product went up 10%. And then when they rolled back the business privilege tax back then, the price of the green tea was still $1.10. By doing it this way, we're going to open the door for non-transparent price increases, because the price environment will get very noisy. Prices will be adjusting all over the island, and enterprises will naturally push the envelope. They'll increase their prices by far more than just 1%. I promise you, you're not going to see an item that used to be selling for $10 be sold for $10.10. You're not going to see something that was selling for $1 be sold for $1.01. You're going to see it go up to $1.25, $1.15, $1.10. And that is not a 1% increase. And then when that increase sunsets on September 30th, it's not going to go back down to $1. It's going to stay at $1.10 or $1.15 because the consumer's already adjusted to it. And then on top of that, this amendment is going to levy a 2% sales tax on that new $1.15 item. So now the customer is going to be paying two and a fraction of a cent instead of just 2 pennies. But when you spread that out over large purchases, a $200 grocery bill that goes up to $210 or $220, all of a sudden you're paying $4.40 in sales tax as opposed to just $4 if you had just gone with a straight sales tax. I cannot emphasize enough how this is definitely not the avenue that should be taken. This, of all the proposals we've seen so far, this would cause the most pain on our people. I respectfully object to the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator San Nicolas. There's an objection. Senator Uggan on the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I too would like to respectfully object to the amendment, but let's look at the environment today, because we've heard repeated comments about the need for cash to offset any anticipated general fund reduction for the balance of the fiscal year. But Mr. Chairman, we look at the print media today. They highlight that beginning Saturday, under the Department of Parks and Recreation, they're going to close all the facilities in the evenings. They're going to shut down the Tizen and the Dededo Sports Complex in the evenings, inclusive of Adelup Field, the Paseo Stadium, and the Guerrero Field. Well, let's look at the numbers, Mr. Chairman. Parks and Recreation being shut down under the guise of general fund shortfall. Going into the budget, the Department of Parks and Recreation, Mr. Chairman, was allocated a $4.3 million budget, of which $395,000 of the $4.3 million is general fund, 9.1% of the total allocation in this fiscal year's budget of $4.3 million. The remaining balance of $3.9 million is allocated from the Limited Gaming Fund, from the Public Recreation Service Fund, and from the Tourist Attraction Fund. The Limited Gaming Fund in the amount of $608,000, the Public Recreation Fund, Service Fund in the amount of $172,000, and the Tourist Attraction Fund, which I'm under the impression, because of the record numbers, continues to bring in good projected revenues into the Tourist Attraction Fund, of which $3.2 million is allocated to the Department of Parks and Recreation. So based on the news coverage, we are willing to close down parks and recreation facilities in the evenings, fields that are actively being utilized, shut down the swimming pools in Agatna and in Dededo for a 9.1% impact to the general fund or to that agency's budget from the general fund. 9.1%, Mr. Chairman. Are we playing a game here or what? Is it really general fund? Because all of these parks and all of these facilities and all of these pools should remain open, because 9.1% is originating from the general fund. And incidentally, Mr. Chairman, the 9.1% is lockbox. Take a look at the budget. because it's lockbox and it said it shall not be utilized for anything other than the Guam Historic Resources Division. So 9.1%, $395,000 out of Parks and Recreation's budget, out of a total of 4.3. And yet, we're going to impact our community, our kids, our sports, our family members who enjoy these games, when the funds don't even impact. $3.9 million of that doesn't even impact the general fund. That's one question I have, Mr. Chair. Are we playing games? If we are, from that Adelup, then they got to stop. They got to stop now. Because my understanding, again, is that the Limited Gaming Fund, the Public Recreation Service Fund, and the TAF, which allocates $3.98 million to Parks and Rec, finances all the maintenance and the operations of these pools and these playing fields for the benefit of our community. And $395,000 is lockbox for the Guam Historic Resources Division. So, Mr. Chairman, some people have got to really take a look at their numbers. Because if it's the general fund that we need to replenish, then we need to focus on the general fund. Don't shut down fields when, in fact, the Tourist Attraction Fund is financing $3.2 million out of that for operations of Parks and Rec. These fields and these swimming pools are benefiting our community today. And we should not scare them by virtue of saying we're going to shut it down because of budgetary concerns, when in fact, only $395,000 of that is going, of the $4.3 million for Parks and Rec is going to the Guam Historic Resources Division, lockbox. Another thing, Mr. Chairman, that was shared with us, and this is something that I really, it hits home because it's part of public safety. There's been statements out there that in fact they're looking at shutting down 50% of the streetlights out there in our community under the guise of general fund requirements or reduction in revenues. Let's take a look at the streetlights. Out of a $6.4 million allocation in this fiscal year's budget, Mr. Chairman, we all know, those of us in the community that own a vehicle, we pay a streetlight fund. The anticipated revenue to be generated for this fiscal year under the streetlight fund vehicle registration is about $4.8 million. So the balance, Mr. Chairman, based on the budget that was allocated this fiscal year, was 1.6. You know where that funding source came from? Not from the general fund, Mr. Chairman. It came from the unappropriated Guam Highway Fund balance. And that is based on information from OFB and the chairman of appropriation that prepared this. So we're threatening to shut down streetlights, affect the safety of our kids and our people out there in the community under the guise of general fund reduction in revenues, when in fact our streetlights are being funded out of the $4.8 million that our vehicle owners pay under the registration every year that they register the vehicles. Approximately $4.8 million is going to come from the streetlight fund. And the balance is not even coming from the general fund, Mr. Chair. The balance, based on the budget, is from the unappropriated Guam Highway Fund balance. $6.4 million for our streetlights. There's absolutely no reason why any streetlight should be shut down as a result of this budgetary issue with the general fund. And there's no reason why our swimming pools and our playing parks and our ball fields should be shut down as a result of this. Enough said, Mr. Chairman, and that's why I oppose the amendment until the administration representatives, are forward with us and give us the truth and don't scare our people. Because shutting down facilities and shutting down operations, shutting down streetlights and shutting down parks that benefit our community and provide additional safety to our community, and it's not even impacting the general fund, is the wrong thing to do. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Uggan. Any other senator on the amendment? If there is Senator Torres, you recognize.
I'd like to share a different perspective on this. Something has to happen. We need infused revenue immediately into the government of Guam. And even in looking at, I'm not a proponent of raising taxes, but I know that in desperate times when we were once faced with the same scenario, back in 2003, we had to take drastic measures for a temporary period until things could improve upon themselves. The different perspective that I want to offer is this. There's a lot of discussion about the sales tax being the ideal tax for Guam, and the desire for the business community and others to phase out of the GRT and into a sales tax scheme. Now, we know that we have some limitations because of the GRTs that have been pledged against bond indebtedness, and that the most that we could ever reduce our GRT can be no more than bringing it, it can't be brought below 3%. Presently, we're at 4%. And what I believe this measure is trying to do is to find a marry that actually sets a platform and a foundation from which we can aspire, and we can actually attain a gradual phase out of the GRT for a sales tax. Both taxes, we know, are regressive taxes. There's nothing that we can do about that. They are regressive taxes. I, among others in this room, have a lot of heartburn about the fact that GRTs are not being adequately collected or assessed, for that matter, on legitimate businesses that should be contributing their legitimate share. But that's a discussion for another time. Today, we need an immediate infusion of cash. 2% at a GRT was deemed to be excessive. So this proposes to bring it down to a level of 1%. I believe that in doing this, in doing it in this way, we do two things. One is we infuse the government with revenues as a result of a 1% increase, but we sunset it to the fiscal year 2018. So it at least gives us a period to put money in and right-size everything else that needs to be right-sized about this government. No doubt the government can be reorganized and should be reorganized. The expenses should be cut in terms of how we operate. It cannot be business as usual. But we also cannot affect a change to the business as usual scheme without doing something different. And this is the difference that we have to effect now to set that foundation. What I believe can happen, I do agree with the retiring speakers before, that if we have 1% and then add a 2% on October 28th, that could theoretically be raising the taxes by more than what we're doing today. And that's going to be a big burden on our community. What we have to understand, too, is that the Jobs and Tax Act does have some relief on the ratepayers, in that and the companies, in that it's anticipated to be an economic boost where more money is left into their pockets. So that theory still stands. But what this does, at least, is it allows us to infuse it with a 1% increase. It holds off a sales tax. And that's not to say that when the sales tax takes effect that we can't roll back the GRT not only to 4%, but perhaps to 3%, so that you end up with in the same place. The reason that I believe we have to, and I called this a horse pill, and I'm not one to advocate, but we do know that this whole discussion started even before the Jobs and Tax Act. It started with the plight of GMH. And we can't lose sight of that. There are many theories to why GMH isn't operating well. Perhaps it's a very bad business plan. Perhaps it's the medically indigent component of our population that overburdens them because of their non-payment status. But all that aside, we can't deny the fact that GMH needs to be improved upon. And what we do in generating extra monies, whether this in the form of a sales tax at 2% with a dedicated source going forward is something that we can't deny is needed. On top of all the other things that we have to do in terms of not operating under business as usual. To say that we should do nothing at this point in terms of infusing revenue is not enough, I believe, and I've come to that conclusion after weeks of debating this. And the economist that spoke at the Guam Women's Chamber of Commerce forum, also in his outside and unbiased perspective, discussed how in situations as dire as Guam's, there's really, the formula to digging yourself out of this is really a left hand and a right hand. You have to both infuse the cash revenues through a mechanism that's usually a rate increase in taxes, and you have to cut your expenses. Both. It can't be one or the other. So either way, as many of us has repeated over and over and over, we're going to take the cuts. We're going to have to make the cuts to salaries, to services. It's inevitable. But at least going forward, if we're going to contemplate phasing out GRT, maybe bringing it back to a level where it's only 3% at some point in a year, in 2 years, whether it's moving from a gross receipts tax system to a sales tax system, those all take time, but you have to start someplace. And I think that this was an attempt to find that marry. At this point, nothing is desirable, and we're really split. But I also know that we're caught between a rock and a hard place. And when you're caught between a rock and a hard place, as even the economists who spoke at that forum, you really are only given two options. You have to raise your taxes at least temporarily, and this also calls for a sunset for this fiscal year. And you have to cut your costs. I don't think we're proposing one or the other. We're proposing both in whatever measure we take today. But I just feel, Mr. Chairman, that we will advocate. There are many theories about how the Trump tax bill is really a win, that it should play out well in terms of being an economic incentive. Our governor spoke to that in January. He was touting what a great thing this was going to be. It's going to put more money in the economy. All theories can be relevant. But I think at the immediate time between now and the end of the fiscal year and going into fiscal year 2019, we are going to see some very, very hard times on Guam, much the same way we did in 2003 after we were hit by devastating storms. Our island's tourism economy plummeted. Our infrastructure was devastated. I think we're at that dark period in our history again. And there was an example of how we crawled out of it, and it wasn't tricking anybody into putting more money in, and we weren't going to own up to the other side of the equation, because I think that there's no way out of that other side of the equation. It's going to be both. We're going to be hungry for a while, and we're going to pay more for less for a while. But I think that's where Guam is, sad to say. And a lot of it had to do with bad business practices, bad decisions, bad political decisions. And God help us if those political decisions stay hold from now until the general election. Things have got to change. It's not business as usual, but as much as it pains me, I do support this amendment. And in fact, I have another amendment that will amend that section of Title 11, Chapter 26, to increase the BPT from 4% to 5% until September 2018. Mr. Chairman, we understand that I'm a very conservative person, and I wouldn't put myself out this way. I understand the political ramifications of increasing taxes, but I think our people need to understand the honest truth. Regardless of what we do today, people are going to hurt, jobs are going to be lost, hours are going to be cut, we're going to pay more for less out of this government until we can figure out how to fix the blueprint of how we run our government, and until we can get to a point where we collect what is lawfully due from people who are skirting their obligations to pay GRTs. That's the other side. But there are many things about right-sizing us. But unfortunately, it's going to cost us a little bit. And I know that the administration in 2003 felt the same way, and they had to swallow that very hard pill. And they had to hurt people for a while, but it was what was the pathway to recovery. And I think if we can, as a body, stay strong to demanding that it isn't business as usual by the government, then we can at least survive to fiscal year 2018 and have some clear path to what 2019 might look like. But that's the other side to the story. It's essentially you have to set something straight if you're really going to change something. This is the start of a change, and for that I support this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Torres. Any others on the Morrison amendment? If not, Senator Morrison, would you like to close? I'm sorry, Senator Morrison, Senator